The Instagram account that would later become crucial evidence in an international murder investigation still exists, preserved as both digital memorial and stark warning about trust, misplaced in dangerous circumstances far from home. The final uploads from Meera Patel's profile show a vibrant 28-year-old Indian architect posing against breathtaking Egyptian landscapes. The Great Pyramids at sunset, ancient temples along the Nile, colorful marketplaces in Cairo. Her captions documenting what began as a joyful family wedding attendance, but transformed into extended solo adventure that she described as finding myself in the cradle of civilization. The photos from her last 3 weeks alive reveal subtle changes that investigators would later identify as warning signs hidden in plain sight. A new man appearing with increasing frequency in her images, her messages home becoming less regular, and eventually concerning shifts in her appearance including noticeable weight loss, diminished smile, and final photos where her typically confident gaze seemed replaced by something more guarded, her eyes showing what friends and family would later describe as a shadow we all missed until it was too late. Detective Omar Mahmoud of the Cairo Police Department's Special Crimes Unit would later describe the Patel case as revealing the perfect predatory pattern that transformed what should have been a carefree travel experience into calculated victimization that exploited cultural disorientation, isolation from support networks, and romantic idealization of cross-cultural connection that blinded an otherwise intelligent woman to escalating danger signals until escape became impossible. The investigation uncovered methodical grooming by Hassan El Farouk, a 34-year-old tour guide with documented history of targeting foreign women travelers, establishing a timeline of calculated exploitation that began with seemingly serendipitous meeting at the Egyptian Museum and ended 90 days later, with Meera's body discovered in a shallow grave near the desert outskirts of Giza, her disappearance having finally generated the international media attention that forced local authorities to overcome initial reluctance to investigate thoroughly when a foreign tourist vanishes in a country heavily dependent on tourism, revenue, and protective of its international image. Meera Patel had arrived in Hurghada on a typically beautiful March morning, the kind of picture-perfect day that fulfills every tourism brochure promise and reinforces Egypt's reputation as ideal destination for experiencing ancient wonders alongside modern resort luxury. Her initial week-long itinerary centered around cousin Ria's destination wedding, with plans including traditional pre-wedding celebrations, the beachfront ceremony itself, and several days of group excursions to nearby attractions before most of the wedding party, including the bride and groom, would return to their professional lives across India and its global diaspora. Text messages and social media posts from this period show Meera in her element, organizing impromptu group photographs against spectacular backdrops, researching historical context for sites beyond tourist information provided, and generally serving as enthusiastic cultural bridge, leveraging her architectural expertise and natural curiosity to enhance everyone's appreciation of Egyptian heritage beyond surface experiences typical package tours provide. The decision that would ultimately place Meera in fatal danger came during the final days of wedding festivities when she announced to surprised family members that she had decided to extend her one-week vacation to a full month, planning to explore Cairo, Luxor, and the Valley of Kings before eventually returning to her architectural practice in Mumbai. This spontaneous extension reflected both her adventurous personality and specific life circumstances. She had recently completed major design project with accompanying bonus, temporarily reduced client load following intense work period, and growing interest in historical architectural influences that Egypt could provide for her professional development. Family members later recalled mild concerns about her solo travel plans, though these were largely alleviated by her confident personality, previous independent international travel experience, and clear excitement about exploring beyond typical tourist experiences in a country whose ancient architectural marvels had fascinated her throughout her academic and professional development. The digital breadcrumbs that allowed investigators to reconstruct Meera's final months revealed how her travels progressed from mainstream tourism to increasingly off-the-beaten-path experiences, with her social media documenting transition from luxury resort areas to more authentic neighborhoods in Cairo, local frequented restaurants, and eventually locations accessible primarily to those with local connections and transportation. The investigation would establish that the critical turning point occurred approximately 2 weeks into her extended stay, when Mira first encountered Hassan El Farouk at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Their meeting documented in what appeared to be spontaneous group photo that she posted with caption, "When your museum guide turns out to be the best photographer. Number lucky find, number real Egypt, number solo travel." This seemingly chance encounter, investigators would determine, actually represented calculated targeting by someone who had observed her repeated visits to the museum, identified her as traveling alone based on observation patterns, and recognized vulnerability masked as independence. The relationship between Mira and Hassan developed with disarming normalcy at first, their early interactions following familiar pattern of tourist guide relationship that countless travelers experience without tragic outcomes. He showed her hidden gems of his city, introduced her to authentic local experiences beyond guidebook recommendations, and presented himself as educated local, eager to share his culture with appreciative foreigner. Text messages to friends and family during this period reveal Mira's initial appreciation for his knowledge, describing Hassan as incredibly insightful about aspects of Egyptian history they never teach us, and expressing excitement about experiencing the real Egypt beyond tourist traps. The digital trail shows her original return flight to Mumbai canceled approximately 3 weeks into her stay, coinciding with increasing appearance of Hassan in her social media posts, and first subtle indications of isolation, as her communication with family and friends became less frequent, while focusing increasingly on discoveries and experiences rather than personal updates or responses to concerned inquiries about her extended stay. The investigation would eventually establish through witness testimony, electronic evidence, and Hassan's own confession following arrest that his interest in Mira represented not spontaneous connection, but calculated targeting, his pattern of behavior consistent with what investigators recognized as established methodology, refined through multiple previous relationships with foreign women travelers. His background, obscured through deliberate misrepresentation during their relationship, included multiple complaints from previous female tourists alleging financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and in 2 cases, physical intimidation, though none had previously escalated to violence, resulting in formal charges, partly due to challenges victims faced pursuing complaints after returning to their home countries, and partly through strategic relationship dissolution once financial objectives had been achieved. Mira's particular vulnerability lay in combination of her independent travel status, extended stay beyond typical tourist time frame, and professional success that made her attractive target for financial exploitation through romance scam that Hassan had previously employed successfully with other foreign women without detection or consequence. The warning signals that appeared in Mira's communications during her final weeks in Egypt reflected textbook patterns of isolation and control, though their gradual intensification meant no single message triggered sufficient alarm among family or friends to prompt intervention before it was too late. Her once frequent social media posts decreased in both frequency and detail, with fewer photographs of herself and more generic tourist images. Messages to close friends and family became increasingly delayed and brief, with concerning statements like, "Sorry for the late reply, I'm so busy exploring," and "The internet is really spotty here," that investigators would later identify as classic excuses suggested by Hassan to explain communication reduction as he systematically isolated her from support networks. Most troubling was the communication pattern itself, with reduced frequency interspersed with occasional bursts of contact that seemed designed to prevent anyone from becoming concerned enough to take action, a manipulation technique investigators would determine likely represented Hassan's influence rather than Mira's own communication patterns. The financial exploitation that became central to both relationship dynamic and ultimate murder motive emerged gradually, with Hassan introducing investment opportunity approximately 1 month into their relationship, a supposed partnership in exclusive tour business, serving high-end Indian tourists, leveraging Mira's cultural background and his local expertise. Bank records recovered during investigation documented series of transfers from her accounts to his, beginning with relatively modest amount that investigators recognized as typical testing transfer, establishing victims' willingness to provide funds followed by increasingly substantial amounts as relationship progressed and trusting foundation had been established. The total eventually reached approximately $45,000, representing significant portion of her savings and recent project bonus, transferred for business. That investigation would determine never existed beyond basic frowned website and minimal documentation created specifically to support the scam rather than reflecting legitimate enterprise development. The final weeks of Meera Patel's life remain partially obscured despite extensive investigation, with gaps in the timeline that may never be fully reconstructed due to deliberate evidence destruction and the remote locations where they traveled beyond consistent witness observation. What investigators established with certainty is that approximately 75 days into what had begun as one-week wedding attendance, Meera began discovering inconsistencies in Hassan's business claims, with bank records showing multiple cash withdrawals from business account without corresponding expense documentation, and her increasingly direct questions about enterprise development meeting evasive responses. Text messages recovered from cloud storage document growing tension, with exchanges showing her heightened concern about financial irregularities and his increasingly aggressive defensiveness when questioned. The final documented communication from Meera to anyone outside the relationship was messaged to her sister Priya, stating simply, "Something feels off about Hassan's business. Looking into flights home next week. We'll call when I have details." This message, which would later be identified as critical evidence indicating her recognition of potential deception and intent to leave Egypt, was followed by complete communication silence that family members initially attributed to poor connectivity, but which investigation would determine represented the period when Hassan, confronted about financial discrepancies and facing loss of both relationship and continuing revenue source, responded with fatal violence that transformed financial exploitation into murder. The official investigation into Meera Patel's disappearance began far too late to prevent tragedy, initiated only after repeated increasingly desperate inquiries from family members who had gone from concerned to alarmed during 2 weeks of complete communication silence, following months of gradually decreasing contact. The delayed response reflected troubling patterns in how missing foreigners are sometimes treated by authorities in tourist regions, with initial reports dismissed with suggestions she had likely just traveled to area with poor cell service or chosen to extend stay without informing family, assumptions that wasted critical early investigation time and allowed for evidence destruction that significantly complicated subsequent prosecution. Only when her case generated social media attention through campaign orchestrated by her sister Priya and pressure from Indian consular officials did serious investigation begin, eventually leading Detective Mahmood to surveillance footage, witness testimony, and finally physical evidence that revealed not accidental death or random crime, but deliberate murder following financial exploitation when the victim discovered the deception and threatened both relationship end and potential exposure that might have prevented Hassan employing similar methodology with future targets. The architectural career that defined Meera Patel's identity beyond family relationships reflected exceptional talent and determination, with her graduation from prestigious Mumbai Design Institute leading to rapid professional advancement through combination of technical skill, creative vision, and effective client communication that colleagues would later describe as her particular strength. Her specialization in blending contemporary functionality with elements drawn from traditional Indian design principles had established growing reputation within Mumbai's competitive architectural community, with recent residential complex project incorporating historically inspired courtyard concepts into modern urban housing, earning industry recognition and professional momentum that made her spontaneous Egyptian journey extension particularly surprising to colleagues accustomed to her typically meticulous planning and career-focused decision-making. This professional success had created not only financial independence that made extended international travel possible without significant hardship, but also confidence, navigating unfamiliar environments and interacting with diverse individuals, qualities that paradoxically may have contributed to her vulnerability through reduced caution that more experienced travelers might have exercised when encountering someone like Hassan, whose predatory methodology specifically targeted self-assured women whose independence masked potential vulnerability when operating outside familiar cultural contexts. The family wedding that brought Mira to Egypt had been planned over 18 months, with her cousin Ria selecting Hurghada resort destination that combined traditional ceremonial possibilities with vacation atmosphere appealing to guests traveling internationally for celebration. Mira's particular enthusiasm for the location connected to her long-standing fascination with Egyptian architectural history, with text messages to friends before departure, showing her excitement about opportunity to experience firsthand the ancient structures she had studied throughout academic training and continued to reference in her contemporary design work. Her role during wedding festivities extended beyond typical guest participation to include impromptu guided explanations of architectural elements encountered during group excursions, with family video showing her animated descriptions of construction techniques and historical context that several relatives later noted seemed to foreshadow her decision to extend her stay for deeper exploration beyond superficial tourist experiences the group activities had provided. The extended family dynamics, revealed through investigation interviews, established Mira's position as respected independent voice within traditionally oriented family structure, with her professional success and financial autonomy, creating space for decisions that might otherwise have faced greater scrutiny or intervention within more conventional expectations. This family context proved significant in understanding why her communication reduction and extended stay generated concern but not immediate alarm or intervention, with relatives accustomed to her independent decision-making and self-sufficient problem-solving throughout previous international travels. The balance she had previously maintained between individual autonomy and family connection created foundation of trust that Hassan's systematic isolation techniques effectively exploited, with relatives interpreting communication changes as reflecting immersion in Egyptian experiences, rather than recognizing warning signs of manipulation by someone deliberately separating her from support networks through incremental contact reduction, strategically managed to prevent acute concern while achieving gradual isolation. The pre-existing interest in Egyptian architecture and history that had initially excited Mira about the wedding location became critical vulnerability factor when it provided Hassan perfect conversational entry point during the museum encounter, with his carefully researched knowledge about architectural elements matching her professional interests, creating immediate connection that she interpreted as serendipitous shared passion rather than calculated targeting based on observation and social media research. Investigators would later determine he had conducted before their seemingly spontaneous meeting. His background preparation had identified specific topics likely to resonate with her architectural expertise, creating conversation that impressed her with apparent depth while actually reflecting strategic research designed to establish credibility and connection through knowledge areas, specifically selected based on her professional background and documented interests visible through public social media content. The extended hotel checkout documented through resort records marked official beginning of Mira's independent Egyptian journey, with staff recalling her excitement about upcoming exploration and specific questions regarding transportation options to Cairo that reflected her intention to experience the country beyond standard tourist pathways. The transitional period between group wedding activities and solo travel included significant practical arrangements, including accommodation changes from luxury resort to more modest Cairo hotel that investigation would establish Hassan had recommended, representing first subtle influence, directing her toward environments where his control could increase without institutional structures. Luxury properties typically provide, including security staff, formal transportation services, and international communication infrastructure that might have complicated his developing isolation strategy and eventual financial exploitation methodology. The initial Cairo experiences, documented through Mira's enthusiastic social media posts, showed genuine excitement about architectural discoveries beyond tourist highlights, with particular focus on Islamic Cairo's historic mosques, traditional courtyard homes, and distinctive mashrabiyya window screens that she specifically noted as design elements with potential contemporary application in her Mumbai architectural practice. These early independent explorations, occurring before Hassan's regular presence emerged in her timeline, showed authentic engagement with Egyptian architectural heritage that aligned with her professional interests and personal enthusiasm without indication of the manipulation that would gradually emerge as Hassan systematically inserted himself into her experience. Through calculated encounters at locations, her predictable exploration patterns made easily anticipated, given her documented architectural interests and logical site progression. The relationship development between Mira and Hassan followed textbook grooming patterns that domestic violence and exploitation experts would later identify as classic methodology, beginning with genuine value provision, through knowledgeable guidance and practical assistance that established credibility and trust foundation before transitioning toward control mechanisms introduced incrementally to normalize relationship dynamics that more objective analysis would immediately identify as problematic, but which gradual implementation made difficult to recognize from within developing situation. Early interactions focused entirely on meeting her stated interests through exclusive access to architectural sites, historical context enhancing her professional appreciation, and authentic local experiences, creating impression of special connection, transcending typical tourist guide relationship. This value-forward approach established dependency through genuine service before introducing control elements that might otherwise have triggered caution, creating relationship foundation, where his knowledge and connections represented significant enhancement to her Egyptian experience that she would become reluctant to sacrifice, even as troubling elements began emerging within dynamic that had initially seemed ideal enhancement to her independent exploration. The digital evidence documenting relationship evolution revealed Hassan's systematic methodology through location pattern analysis, with initial encounters occurring exclusively at public locations before gradually transitioning toward increasingly private settings as trust established through legitimate knowledge sharing and experience enhancement created foundation for isolation that more objective analysis would immediately identify as concerning, but which incremental implementation normalized through graduated exposure, aligned with increasing relationship development. The photographic timeline showed clear progression from museum and major architectural site meetings, where other tourists provided ambient security through public presence, toward less trafficked historical locations with limited visitor numbers, and eventually private experiences completely separated from tourist infrastructure or observation opportunities that might have created witness perspectives. Had the exploitation pattern been recognized before fatal conclusion, when financial deception, discovery triggered violence that transformed ongoing exploitation into murder. The communication pattern changes that family members retrospectively identified as warning signs emerged gradually rather than suddenly, reflecting Hassan's sophisticated understanding of isolation techniques that too rapid implementation might have triggered intervention. The methodical approach included initial enhancement, where his contributions actually increased her communication through exciting discoveries and experiences worth sharing, followed by subtle redirection introducing technical explanations for reduced contact, including supposed connectivity limitations in certain areas, scheduled activities during typical communication times, and eventual suggestions about excessive online sharing, potentially undermining authentic experience immersion. This graduated implementation transformed Mira's typically consistent communication pattern toward increasingly irregular contact, without triggering immediate alarm that sudden silence might have created, establishing isolation through incremental changes that individual family members observed, partially, but which comprehensive pattern analysis would have immediately identified as classic control mechanism, had collective observations been systematically compared before tragedy made retrospective analysis the only option remaining. The financial exploitation methodology that investigation uncovered represented sophisticated approach, refined through previous implementation with other victims, with Hassan's technique demonstrating clear pattern that tourist police had documented through multiple complaints without previously connecting to single perpetrator due to investigation limitations, when victims typically returned to home countries before case development could complete. The approach followed consistent progression, beginning with relationship establishment through genuine value provision, before introducing business opportunities specifically designed to leverage victims' background. In Mira's case, her Indian heritage and architectural expertise, creating supposed perfect combination with his local knowledge for specialized tour business, targeting wealthy Indian travelers, seeking authentic Egyptian experiences beyond standard tourist offerings. The investment opportunity introduction timing reflected calculated approach, with financial discussions beginning only after sufficient emotional connection had been established to create trust foundation, but before relationship had progressed to potential marriage expectations that might have complicated extraction strategy, requiring relationship dissolution once financial objectives had been achieved. The business proposal documentation recovered during investigation demonstrated remarkable preparation sophistication, with professional quality website, comprehensive business plan, and convincing market analysis, creating legitimacy impression that would have challenged even professionally cautious evaluation, much less review by someone without business background whose emotional connection to presenter created inherent trust bias. The materials specifically targeted Mira's architectural interests, with dedicated sections addressing historical site access advantages their partnership could exclusively provide, specialized architectural insights beyond standard tours that her expertise could develop, and client experience differentiation through combination of insider Egyptian knowledge and cultural connection with Indian clients that competitors couldn't replicate. This tailored approach represented significant advance preparation rather than opportunistic exploitation, with materials investigation determined had been specifically modified from previous versions used with other victims, demonstrating systematic methodology, refinement through multiple implementations, rather than spontaneous opportunity exploitation that less organized criminals might attempt without similar preparation investment. The transaction records documenting financial exploitation progression showed classic pattern exploitation experts immediately recognized as strategic testing and escalation methodology, beginning with relatively modest initial investment request, establishing compliance foundation before systematically increasing amount through incremental steps, presenting logical business development requirements, including licensing, costs, equipment purchases, marketing expenses, and eventually property lease requirements for supposed business office that investigation would determine never existed beyond virtual documentation, created specifically to justify continuing fund transfers. The transaction timing demonstrated sophisticated psychological understanding regarding appropriate intervals between requests, with sufficient separation, preventing obvious pattern recognition while maintaining momentum through continuous development requirements, creating impression of business progress, justifying additional investment beyond initial agreement. This systematic approach extracted approximately $45,000 over roughly 2 months before Mira began questioning discrepancies between supposed business development and observable results that should have been manifesting through actual client bookings, website traffic, or tangible business infrastructure beyond documentation and verbal assurances. Hassan provided without substantiating evidence. Increasingly sophisticated victim, eventually recognized as problematic, despite emotional connection clouding. Objective analysis capacity. The witness testimony from various Cairo businesses established timeline details investigation otherwise couldn't reconstruct, given limited digital evidence from period after Hassan achieved significant isolation, with hotel staff, restaurant employees, and transportation providers offering crucial observations about relationship dynamic evolution, showing clear progression from apparently genuine romantic connection toward increasingly concerning interaction patterns observers recognized as troubling but lacked intervention mechanism to address. Particularly significant was Shisha Cafe waiter who reported overhearing heated conversation approximately 2 weeks before Mira's disappearance, with her questioning regarding business development meeting, increasingly aggressive responses before Hassan physically grabbed her wrist with sufficient force that waiter considered intervention before hostile glance prevented involvement. He later expressed profound regret about given subsequent events. This witness account established critical timeline element, showing escalation from financial exploitation toward physical intimidation when questioning threatened continuing extraction, representing significant evidence regarding both relationship deterioration and Hassan's capacity for violence when deception faced exposure that might threaten both immediate financial objective and methodology viability for future victim targeting. The bank record analysis conducted once investigation properly launched revealed damning evidence regarding both exploitation methodology and murder motive development, with transaction history showing business account. Hassan had established receiving regular transfers from Mira's personal accounts before systematic withdrawals removed funds without corresponding legitimate business expenses. The financial tracking established clear pattern where her investment transferred directly to his personal benefit through cash withdrawals, luxury purchases, and debt payments completely unrelated to supposed business development, creating comprehensive documentation regarding fraudulent scheme, providing primary motivation for violence when discovery threatened both continued financial extraction and potential criminal exposure that might prevent similar future implementations. Particularly significant was transfer pattern timing correlation with communication reduction, showing direct relationship between increasing financial commitment and decreasing external contact. That classic exploitation analysis immediately identifies as vulnerability indicator, where isolation intensity typically corresponds directly with exploitation escalation, as perpetrator seeks to prevent external perspective that might identify deception before financial objectives achieve completion. The accommodation progression revealed through investigation established another classic vulnerability expansion indicator, with Mira's lodging changing from initial international standard hotel with appropriate security, communication infrastructure, and professional staff toward increasingly local establishments with reduced security presence, limited international communication capacity, and fewer documentation requirements that might have created useful records once investigation belatedly commenced. The final known accommodation before her disappearance was apartment and building owned by Hassan's cousin, representing complete removal from commercial hospitality infrastructure that might have provided both protection through established security protocols and investigation evidence through systematic record-keeping typical international standard properties maintain, but which private accommodation arrangements specifically avoid, creating vulnerability through isolation from protective infrastructure, while simultaneously eliminating potential evidence, sources that standard tourism accommodation would typically generate through registration requirements, security monitoring, and professional staff trained to recognize concerning situations that private arrangements specifically circumvent. The daily routine reconstruction developed through witness interviews and limited surveillance footage recovery established how Hassan had systematically increased time commitment requirements, preventing independent exploration, opportunities that might have created connections beyond his influence, with initial flexibility providing genuine value through knowledge sharing, gradually transforming toward increasingly structured schedules preventing unmonitored activities. This progression represented classic control mechanism where initial freedom demonstrating apparent relationship health incrementally restricts through plausible activity requirements, eventually establishing comprehensive monitoring, preventing independent movement that might create external connection opportunities beyond perpetrator influence. The scheduling control, interlinked with communication, limitation, and physical isolation, created comprehensive separation from potential intervention resources, establishing vulnerability condition, where victim faced decreasing opportunity for external assistance access, exactly as exploitation escalation created increasing need for outside perspective that might have identified deception before. Financial loss culminated in violence when scheme faced exposure through victims' growing awareness regarding discrepancies between investment and observable business development. The investigation into Mira's final days faced significant challenges, given the limited digital evidence following Hassan's phone confiscation described by multiple witnesses who observed him holding her phone for safekeeping during activities approximately 3 weeks before her disappearance. Action he explained as protecting expensive device during certain excursions, but which exploitation experts immediately identify as critical control mechanism eliminating independent communication capacity. The timeline reconstruction through witness testimony established their last public appearance at Khan el-Khalili Market 4 days before financial institution records show her attempted account access from Cairo Internet Cafe. Action investigators believe represented her attempt to verify financial discrepancies she had begun suspecting based on business development inconsistencies between documentation and observable progress. This independent investigation, outside Hassan's direct supervision, likely confirmed her suspicions regarding misappropriation creating confrontation catalyst that transformed financial exploitation into physical danger when scheme exposure threatened both continuing extraction and future methodology implementation with other potential victims. The confrontation reconstruction based on Hassan's eventual partial confession and limited physical evidence suggested argument escalation occurring at private apartment where forensic examination discovered evidence of struggle. Despite thorough cleaning attempt, with blood trace evidence matching Mira's DNA identified in bathroom grout lines impossible to completely sanitize without professional knowledge regarding forensic cleaning requirements. The confession, obtained following extensive interrogation after physical evidence eliminated plausible deniability, indicated argument regarding business investment escalated when Mira threatened both relationship termination and potential police reporting that would have exposed methodology, potentially preventing future implementation with other victims. Hassan's claim regarding unplanned violence contradicted physical evidence, showing struggle across multiple apartment areas before fatal assault in bathroom, where limited escape options and confined space created particular vulnerability, with forensic evidence indicating defensive wounds suggesting significant resistance before asphyxiation, death determined through autopsy findings despite body condition, challenges given approximately 2-week interval between death and discovery following social media campaign, and subsequent investigative priority designation that finally initiated appropriate search efforts. The investigation that Detective Omar Mahmoud conducted faced significant institutional resistance, reflecting both tourism protection priorities within Egyptian enforcement structures and resource limitations affecting case prioritization when involving foreign visitors without diplomatic pressure, ensuring appropriate attention. His personal commitment to case resolution, despite these obstacles, represented professional dedication, transcending institutional limitations, with his methodical approach, systematically overcoming official reluctance through carefully documented evidence development, establishing clear homicide determination that jurisdictional authorities could no longer reasonably dismiss as accidental death, voluntary disappearance, or random criminal opportunity. Once comprehensive case building created irrefutable evidence pattern, requiring official acknowledgement and appropriate response allocation, despite institutional preference for less damaging explanations that tourism officials would have strongly preferred given industry sensitivity regarding visitor safety perceptions. The international pressure that ultimately ensured appropriate investigative resource allocation emerged primarily through social media campaign orchestrated by Mira's sister Priya, whose strategic approach combining emotional appeal through personal storytelling with systematic communication targeting media outlets, diplomatic channels, and tourism officials created multi-layered pressure impossible to dismiss through standard redirection techniques officials might otherwise have employed to minimize potential tourism impact. The campaign's effectiveness particularly reflected Priya's professional communication background, with her corporate public relations experience enabling sophisticated strategy development that simultaneously generated public awareness, creating accountability pressure while engaging appropriate diplomatic channels, ensuring official attention without creating unnecessarily antagonistic approach that might have hindered rather than facilitated cooperation necessary for effective investigation within foreign jurisdiction, where family lacked direct influence beyond pressure mechanisms strategically deployed through carefully constructed campaign, balancing emotional appeal with diplomatic engagement. The evidence collection process faced significant challenges given both time interval between disappearance and investigation initiation and Hassan's deliberate evidence destruction efforts, with crime scene processing discovering cleaning chemical residue indicating systematic sanitization attempt that forensic analysis determined would have successfully eliminated most standard evidence detection methods, but failed to address advanced techniques, including alternative light source application, revealing blood residue patterns. Cleaning had visibly removed, but not completely eliminated at microscopic level. Specialized forensic procedures could detect. The collection process particularly benefited from Detective Mahmoud's specialized training, including international certifications through partnership programs with European enforcement agencies. With his methodological approach, applying advanced techniques beyond local standard procedures, that enabled evidence recovery standard processing would have missed, given sophisticated sanitization efforts reflecting Hassan's awareness of basic forensic limitations, but insufficient knowledge regarding advanced detection capabilities. His cleaning attempts failed to defeat, despite superficial scene processing that less thorough investigation might have accepted as indicating absence of evidentiary value, requiring more sophisticated examination. The digital forensics that provided crucial investigative foundation required exceptional international cooperation, with Egyptian authorities working through Interpol channels to access records from Indian service providers, including cloud storage accounts, financial institutions, and communication platforms that documented critical timeline elements. Cleaning attempts couldn't eliminate from virtual evidence landscape despite Hassan's device confiscation, preventing direct access to communication records. Local investigation alone might have failed to recover. This international cooperation reflected both diplomatic pressure, ensuring appropriate resource allocation, and Detective Mahmoud's professional network developed through previous international training programs, creating direct connections with counterparts, facilitating expedited information sharing outside standard bureaucratic channels that might otherwise have created delays, potentially compromising time-sensitive investigation aspects requiring immediate evidence preservation before standard procedural timelines could complete, through official channels, sometimes requiring weeks for information requests that case urgency couldn't accommodate given both justice requirements and continuing public attention, ensuring accountability for appropriate investigative progression. The financial investigation provided crucial motive establishment through comprehensive transaction analysis, documenting systematic fund transfer from Mira's accounts into business entity Hassan controlled before subsequent withdrawals removed investment without corresponding legitimate business expenses, creating clear documentation regarding fraudulent scheme, and establishing direct financial motivation for violence when discovery threatened both continuing extraction and potential methodology, viability for future victim targeting given exposure risk prosecution might create. The analysis particularly benefited from international banking cooperation, facilitating comprehensive transaction history access that standard local investigation might have struggled to develop without specialized financial investigation capabilities. Detective Mahmoud accessed through economic crimes, division, collaboration that typical homicide investigation might have lacked without his recognition regarding case complexity, requiring multidisciplinary approach beyond standard procedural templates, potentially missing critical financial motivation, aspects less comprehensive investigation might have failed to properly document, despite central importance regarding both specific case resolution and pattern recognition, preventing future implementation through similar methodology. Other potential victims might otherwise face without appropriate perpetrator, identification, and methodology, documentation, ensuring future awareness regarding exploitation pattern. Hassan had successfully implemented multiple times before escalation to violence when deception faced exposure. The surveillance camera footage that provided crucial timeline documentation required extensive canvassing beyond standard investigation parameters, with Detective Mahmoud's team identifying private business cameras beyond public security systems. Official investigation might have exclusively relied upon without recognition regarding coverage limitations in areas lacking government monitoring systems. This comprehensive approach identified crucial movement documentation standard canvassing might have missed, with material from small business security systems, providing vital documentation, establishing last known movements before disappearance, and contradicting Hassan's initial statements regarding separation timing before Mira's supposed independent travel. He initially claimed preceded her disappearance, but which footage conclusively disproved through documentation, showing them together significantly after claimed separation. This contradiction provided critical interrogation leverage, eventually contributing toward partial confession, following confrontation with objective evidence, eliminating plausible deniability regarding continued contact despite initial statements suggesting no involvement with her movements during critical period when disappearance occurred. The witness testimony that transformed theoretical case into prosecutable homicide came through Detective Mahmoud's methodical community canvassing, extending beyond standard tourist areas into local neighborhoods, where Hassan Mira had been observed during relationship progression, with residents providing crucial observations regarding interaction pattern evolution, showing increasing control dynamics preceding disappearance. Particularly significant was vegetable market vendor whose stall faced apartment building entrance, with his daily observations documenting both regular joint appearances and concerning interaction patterns, including argument approximately 3 days before final disappearance, where Hassan physically grabbed Mira's arm with sufficient force that witness considered intervention before cultural hesitation regarding involvement in what appeared domestic matter prevented action. He later expressed profound regret about given subsequent tragedy. This testimony established crucial timeline element showing relationship deterioration and physical control escalation preceding disappearance, creating significant evidence regarding progression from financial exploitation toward physical intimidation when questioning threatened continuing extraction. The body recovery that finally occurred following comprehensive search operation, utilizing both traditional methods and innovative techniques, reflected Detective Mahmoud's recognition regarding disposal methodology, likely employed given perpetrator background, local geography knowledge, and transportation access constraints limiting practical options for concealment. The search strategy specifically prioritized remote desert locations accessible through specific vehicle Hassan had documented access to, with tire impression analysis from apartment complex security footage establishing vehicle model utilized during critical overnight period when body transportation likely occurred based on timeline reconstruction. The eventual discovery in remote Wadi location approximately 30 kilometers from Giza represented area requiring both local knowledge for identification and appropriate transportation for access, with location selection reflecting Hassan's regional familiarity but insufficient understanding regarding forensic investigation capabilities. Modern techniques provide, despite remote location and concealment efforts, that basic search might have failed to identify without comprehensive approach, employing both traditional search patterns and technological assistance, including drone surveillance, covering extensive terrain. Physical teams alone couldn't efficiently process given vast potential search area desert landscape presented. The autopsy findings, despite body condition challenges given environmental exposure during approximately 2-week interval between death and discovery, provided crucial cause determination through comprehensive examination, identifying hyoid bone fracture and soft tissue injury patterns consistent with manual strangulation, despite decomposition complications that less thorough examination might have deemed inconclusive. The medical examiner's detailed analysis established not only homicide determination, but specific methodology, suggesting face-to-face confrontation rather than surprise attack, with injury pattern analysis indicating defensive wounds on forearms consistent with conscious resistance attempt rather than unexpected assault, without opportunity for protective reaction. This detailed determination provided important prosecution elements beyond basic homicide establishment, with specific injury pattern supporting premeditation arguments, contrary to Hassan's claims regarding momentary anger without prior intention, positional evidence suggesting deliberate rather than impulsive action, physical analysis, clearly documented through comprehensive examination. Despite challenging conditions, less thorough investigation might have deemed insufficient for detailed determination beyond basic homicide classification without specific methodology. Documentation, forensic examination successfully established despite environmental challenges. The confession that Hassan El Farouk eventually provided following extended interrogation represented partial acknowledgement rather than complete admission, with his statement accepting responsibility for physical confrontation resulting in death, while maintaining financial deception never existed, despite banking evidence conclusively documenting systematic fraud contradicting his characterization. This limited admission reflected strategic approach, attempting punishment minimization through voluntary manslaughter characterization, rather than premeditated murder charges. Substantial evidence supported, with his narrative emphasizing momentary anger following relationship disagreement rather than intentional violence, resulting from fraud discovery, threatening both continuing financial extraction and future methodology implementation with other potential victims. The partial confession particularly attempted establishing cultural context regarding relationship expectations, creating framework for provocation claims that homicide investigation specialists immediately recognized as classic minimization technique, attempting cultural relativism, justification for violence, that universal standards clearly establish as unjustifiable regardless of cultural context or relationship disagreement, despite defense attempts suggesting alternative standards might apply within regional cultural framework. The forensic evidence presented by crime scene analysts provided jurors with detailed understanding of Mira's final moments through scientific reconstruction based on blood pattern analysis, injury documentation, and positional evidence collectively establishing sequence contradicting Hassan's characterization regarding momentary anger without premeditation. The comprehensive analysis documented struggle extending throughout apartment rather than isolated altercation, suggesting spontaneous confrontation, with blood evidence patterns indicating prolonged interaction, traversing multiple rooms before culminating in bathroom, where limited escape options and confined space created particular vulnerability contrary to unplanned interaction. Hassan's partial confession attempted establishing. The crime scene reconstruction particularly emphasized cleaning attempt sophistication, suggesting premeditation through preparation rather than panic response, following unintended outcome, with chemical analysis documenting professional-grade sanitization products purchased approximately 2 days before confrontation based on transaction records, contradicting spontaneous characterization, defense attempted establishing. Despite physical evidence, clearly documenting planning inconsistent with unpremeditated response characterization. The digital evidence presentation provided comprehensive documentation regarding both financial exploitation methodology and relationship deterioration preceding violence, with recovered messages despite deletion attempts showing increasing questioning regarding business development meeting, increasingly aggressive responses in days preceding disappearance. The communication pattern analysis particularly established direct correlation between growing financial commitment and increasing control mechanisms, including communication monitoring, physical movement restrictions, and isolation from external contacts that exploitation specialists immediately identified as classic vulnerability expansion indicators, where control intensity typically escalates proportionally with exploitation progression as perpetrator seeks preventing external perspective, potentially exposing deception. The recovered digital history particularly contradicted Hassan's characterization regarding healthy relationship deteriorating through miscommunication, instead documenting systematic manipulation, creating vulnerability through isolation, specifically when financial questioning threatened, continuing extraction, defining primary relationship, purpose, available evidence comprehensively established, despite defense attempts suggesting alternative characterization, inconsistent with documented communication pattern, objective analysis clearly categorized as exploitation methodology rather than genuine relationship dynamic. Defense characterization suggested despite evidence conclusively establishing predatory rather than authentic interaction. The testimony from Sarah Khalil, Hassan's former girlfriend who came forward following media coverage, provided crucial pattern evidence establishing Mira's experience, represented methodology implementation rather than isolated incident, with her account documenting nearly identical approach, including initial legitimate value provision through knowledge sharing before business opportunity introduction, creating financial exploitation foundation, similar multiple victims subsequently identified had experienced. Her testimony particularly established behavioral patterns, contradicting defense characterization regarding cultural misunderstanding or relationship miscommunication. Instead, documenting calculated methodology, Hassan had refined through multiple implementations with international visitors, sharing similar vulnerability factors despite diverse backgrounds and nationalities, establishing behavioral patterns, transcending cultural-specific justification defense, attempted suggesting, despite evidence clearly documenting systematic methodology application, following consistent template with calculated precision. The closing arguments presented stark contrasting narratives, with prosecution methodically summarizing evidence, establishing predatory pattern, deliberate financial exploitation, and calculated violence when scheme faced exposure, collectively establishing first-degree murder warranting maximum punishment Egyptian law provided. The defense closing attempted reframing evidence through cultural misunderstanding lens, acknowledging responsibility for death while arguing for manslaughter consideration based on relationship context, creating emotionally charged situation, allegedly preventing rational thought necessary for premeditation finding. These competing frameworks establish central tension, guiding judicial consideration, contrasting prosecution's comprehensive evidence, integration against defense, attempts to create mitigating circumstances through cultural context, despite substantial evidence, contradicting impulsive characterization, that pattern, documentation, and physical evidence reconstruction, systematically dismantled through comprehensive presentation, establishing calculated methodology rather than isolated emotional response. The verdict delivered by the three-judge panel following Egyptian criminal procedure established guilty finding on charges including first-degree murder, fraud, and evidence tampering, with judgment specifically rejecting cultural context claims, given evidence establishing pattern, transcending specific relationship circumstances. The sentence imposing 25 years imprisonment represented near maximum punishment available under Egyptian legal framework, with judicial remarks, specifically addressing how case reflected sophisticated predatory targeting, requiring comprehensive response, rather than viewing incident as isolated tragedy or momentary failure of judgment. Evidence clearly established represented pattern culmination rather than aberration. The judgment particularly noted how evidence established methodical victim selection, calculated relationship development, and deliberate exploitation progression that fraud investigation might have interrupted before fatal escalation had earlier. Victims' complaints received appropriate attention that institutional limitations, including tourism protection, priorities, and jurisdictional complications, had unfortunately prevented. Despite multiple previous reports, documentation revealed similar patterns without establishing perpetrator connection. Standard investigation procedures might have identified through appropriate pattern analysis. The international media coverage following verdict delivery reflected evolving understanding regarding both case specifics and broader vulnerability factors affecting travelers navigating unfamiliar environments, with analysis examining systematic exploitation methodology transcending specific cultural context, despite defense attempts suggesting cultural misunderstanding rather than calculated predation. Evidence comprehensively established. The more thoughtful analysis particularly addressed how vulnerability factors including cultural disorientation, support network separation, and romantic idealization created exploitation opportunities. Sophisticated predators specifically target through methodology, refinement across multiple implementations, rather than representing isolated incidents. Cultural differences might explain, despite evidence clearly establishing pattern, transcending specific relationship dynamics or regional context. The diplomatic engagement following case resolution included formal discussions between Egyptian and Indian governmental representatives regarding enhanced cooperation frameworks for cases involving foreign victims, with particular focus on expedited information sharing, improved missing person response protocols, and coordinated support services addressing unique barriers affecting visitors experiencing crime abroad. These conversations acknowledged both investigative complexities when evidence spans multiple countries and specialized victim support needs navigating unfamiliar legal systems while processing trauma far from established support networks. The resulting protocols established improved coordination mechanisms addressing institutional gaps Detective Mahmoud had overcome through extraordinary personal commitment and international relationship development that standard procedures had not adequately facilitated, creating systematic improvements rather than relying on exceptional individual efforts that might not be consistently available in future cases involving similar jurisdictional complications. The psychological impact on Mira's family created complex grief complications extending beyond normal bereavement, with traumatic circumstances, international complications, and awareness regarding systematic predation that might have been prevented through appropriate pattern recognition, creating particularly challenging recovery, requiring specialized support, addressing both loss processing and justice. engagement, extending across international boundaries, creating additional complexity beyond typical grief resolution processes. The support resources specifically developed through community organization, establishing Memorial Foundation, addressing both Mira's specific case and broader traveler protection needs, created meaningful framework, transforming tragedy into prevention opportunity that family members described, providing partial healing through meaningful purpose development, ensuring Mira's experience might protect others from similar vulnerability despite painful knowledge their loved one's death might have been prevented through earlier pattern identification, that system limitations unfortunately failed, providing despite multiple previous reports, documentation indicated existed before fatal escalation occurred. The enduring legacy extending from Mira Patel's tragic death emerged through comprehensive educational resources. The Mira Patel Foundation developed addressing specific warning signs, vulnerability factors, and protective strategies travelers navigating unfamiliar environments might implement, reducing exploitation risk. Sophisticated predators specifically target through calculated methodology refined across multiple implementations. The Foundation particularly focused addressing gap between generic travel safety advice, suggesting universal caution that practical implementation often finds challenging, maintaining throughout extended international experiences, and specific pattern recognition regarding exploitation indicators that concrete examples might more effectively illustrate than abstract warnings. Travelers often find difficult applying to seemingly legitimate relationship developments without specific warning sign. Awareness detailed case studies more effectively provide than generalized cautions that extended travel experiences frequently find challenging, sustaining, when specific danger indicators remain unrecognized. Without particular awareness, education, the Foundation, specifically focused developing through both Mira's case details and similar pattern documentation that collective analysis clearly identified as systematic methodology rather than isolated incidents. Cultural differences might otherwise suggest without comprehensive pattern recognition, appropriate education facilitates more effectively than generic warnings. The investigative protocols developed the rough case examination, created substantial improvement framework addressing institutional limitations. Detective Mahmoud had identified through investigation challenges that systematic reform following case resolution specifically targeted improving through structured response enhancement, addressing barriers including tourism, protection priorities, sometimes limiting appropriate resource allocation cases involving foreign visitors might otherwise receive without specific procedural requirements, ensuring consistent response regardless of potential tourism impact, considerations that legitimate industry protection interests might otherwise prioritize without appropriate balancing, ensuring visitor safety receives equal consideration through methodical response protocols, ensuring consistent investigation application regardless of tourism sensitivity, creating appropriate balance between legitimate industry protection and visitor safety. That comprehensive protocols following Mira's case specifically addressed ensuring similar situations receive appropriate response without requiring extraordinary individual effort. Detective Mahmoud's exceptional commitment had fortunately provided, despite institutional limitations, standard procedures might not have otherwise overcome without systematic improvement, case resolution ultimately facilitated. The personal transformation Priya Patel experienced throughout advocacy process extended beyond justice pursuit for her sister toward meaningful legacy development, ensuring Mira's experience might protect others through educational resources the Foundation developed, specifically addressing vulnerability factors her sister had encountered without recognition regarding danger, indicators education might have identified before exploitation progressed toward fatal conclusion. When fraud discovery triggered violence that earlier awareness might potentially have prevented through appropriate pattern recognition, education specifically facilitates her journey from grieving sister toward educational advocate represented meaningful purpose development, transforming personal tragedy toward broader protection. That Foundation development specifically facilitated creating legacy, ensuring Mira's experience continues, providing protection long after case resolution through educational resources, addressing specific vulnerability factors travelers navigating unfamiliar environments frequently encounter without appropriate Awareness regarding exploitation methodologies. Systematic predators specifically develop targeting particular vulnerability situations. International travel frequently creates without specific education regarding danger recognition that detailed case examination more effectively provides than generic cautions. Practical implementation often finds challenging, maintaining throughout extended international experiences, despite theoretical awareness. General travel advisories might provide without specific methodology recognition. Detailed case studies more effectively illustrate. The documentary film 90 Days, Meera Patel's Journey, premiered 3 years following case resolution, presenting balanced examination regarding both specific details and broader issues affecting vulnerable travelers, without sensationalism or victim-blaming narratives. Earlier media coverage had sometimes employed creating misleading impressions regarding actual exploitation methodology. Evidence had comprehensively established. The film, developed through family cooperation, ensuring both factual accuracy and appropriate representation regarding complex emotions international tragedy creates, provided valuable educational resource. Universities, travel organizations, and safety programs subsequently incorporated illustrating specific vulnerability factors travelers might encounter without recognizing danger. Indicators, education specifically, addressing exploitation methodology more effectively provides than generic warnings. Practical application often finds challenging, implementing without concrete examples. Detailed case studies specifically facilitate understanding that abstract caution alone frequently fails, providing without particular pattern recognition. Systematic education more effectively develops. This thoughtful approach helped transform Meera's story from sensationalized cultural clash narrative into nuanced examination regarding universal exploitation patterns, requiring specific recognition beyond generic travel caution, often proving insufficient without particular methodology. Awareness education specifically facilitates developing more effectively than abstract warnings alone.